Hello! Today, we're going to be talking about the problem of no best world, and how this objection against theism can actually be turned into a rather unique, even radical, theodicy. We'll start by looking at a sort of decision theory paradox involving infinity, and use it to explain why God might allow evil. Anyways, let's jump into things with a pretty straightforward intuition about rationality. When someone acts rationally, they don't knowingly pick worse options when better options are available. This seems unobjectionable, but it quickly leads to a theological paradox. Consider God's decision to create the world. What sort of world should he create? He has infinite options because he's omnipotent. But for any possible world that he could create, it seems that there's always a better world that he could create instead. For example, he could create a world that has nothing except 1 billion people that are perfectly happy for all eternity. But it would technically be irrational for God to create this world, because he has a better option. Create a world that has nothing except 1 billion plus 1 people that are perfectly happy for all eternity. But this too is irrational, because he could create a world with 1 billion plus 2 happy people, and so on. This sort of reasoning seems to apply to literally any option God has. Instead of creating such and such world, he could create that plus 1 extra good thing. This is a problem. Every option that God has, without exception, is worse than some other option and is less an irrational option. And we don't want to say God did something irrational when creating the world, because God, by definition, always behaves in accordance with perfect rationality. As an analogy, it's like you're looking for the biggest number. It's impossible, because there is no biggest number. You could always add 1. Now, you might think that you could just say infinity and be done with this silly paradox. God makes infinity happy people, or something. The end. But set theory tells us that some infinities are bigger than others. So even if God makes infinity people, one could argue that he could make a larger infinity of people instead. Now, I'm not particularly worried by the problem of no best world, because there's a wide variety of plausible resolutions to the paradox. One answer I really like is that God created a multiverse so big that it can't be quantified by set theory. Reality has the maximum amount of good stuff in it, and this is the best option God has. And I actually already believe that such a multiverse exists for reasons completely independent from the problem of no best world. You can look up the anthropic argument. But there's another approach. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there is no best possible world. Absolutely every option open to God is worse than some other option, and my preferred multiverse loophole doesn't work. This would be entailed by certain positions, such as causal finitism. In this case, many are still suspicious of the problem of no best world, because it seems to fault God for failing to do the impossible. If there is no best option available to him, then what's wrong with saying he failed to do the best option? However, you need to be very careful when dealing with the problem of no best world, because it's a rather nuanced argument, and a lot of knee-jerk responses don't actually work. Let's say that God creates 1 billion happy people. It's true that no one can complain, God, you should have created the best possible world instead of this one, because there is no such option available to God. The words best possible world don't refer to any actual option that God has. So that specific complaint doesn't make sense. But someone could still complain, God, you should have created a world with 1 billion plus 1 happy people. Because that is an option open to God. And it seems theologically problematic to be able to make such complaints of God. However, I think there is a way to preserve the core intuition that fundamentally the problem of no best world asks God to do the impossible. The trick is to frame the question in terms of God's desires. Sometimes a desire fails to properly recommend a course of action. In such a scenario, the rational thing to do is to ignore the desire. To illustrate, let's say that Bob has a desire to follow the commands of Alice. She gives him 2 commands. First, wear a hat tomorrow. Second, don't wear a hat tomorrow. So a desire to do what Alice tells him entails contradictory courses of action, assuming Alice manages to close any possible loopholes. What should a rational agent do in this scenario? It seems that the most rational thing for Bob to do is simply ignore his desire to do what Alice says, since this desire can't possibly be fulfilled no matter what he does. He should decide whether to wear a hat based solely on his other desires unrelated to Alice's commands. Now, per the argument, God has a desire to create 1 billion happy people. He also has a desire to create 1 billion plus 1 happy people, and so on. But all of these are grounded in a more foundational desire: value maximization. God has a foundational desire to maximize the amount of good stuff that exists, and all of these specific desires are rooted in that. But if there is no best world, then this foundational desire is simply unfulfillable. Value maximization is what implies God should create the best possible world when there is no best possible world. So, as a rational agent, God must simply screen off his desire for value maximization. He must ignore any considerations about value maximization from his decision-making. And he can't be faulted in any way because it's simply the outcome of a rational agent faced with a desire whose fulfillment is logically impossible. Thus, making a complaint to God that implicitly invokes value maximization, like, "Hey, you should have made one extra good thing," is like telling Bob, "You should have done what Alice told you." These complaints just don't make sense. Now, I phrase this section in the language of satisfying desires, but the point can be reframed if you don't think desire satisfaction is the right way to think about God's actions. There's this thing, something like value maximization, which is a fundamental motivation or guiding principle or whatever that fails to properly recommend a course of action to God, so it doesn't factor into his decision-making. The exact formulation might vary depending on your theology, but you get the idea. So that's one answer to the problem of no best world. If a desire has no logically possible satisfaction, a rational agent is faultless in screening off this desire. Coolio. Now, interestingly enough, if God has to screen off value maximization from his decision-making, this can help answer the problem of evil. Why does God allow evil to exist in the world when an omnibenevolent being would desire to prevent it? The theist can agree that God does indeed possess a desire to prevent all evil in the world. In fact, God also desires to prevent all evil in the world, plus create one extra good thing. He also desires to stop all evil and create 2 good things, and so on. But all of these desires are ultimately rooted in value maximization, which God cannot act upon. Put another way, the problem of evil correctly points out that God has a reason to stop the evil in the world. But this singular reason was part of an infinite hierarchy of reasons whose satisfaction was impossible. So God had to screen off the entire hierarchy, and so God's reason to stop evil has been screened off. I told you this theodicy was radical. Most theodicies posit that evil exists because it is necessary for greater goods, but the No Best World theodicy is one of the rare exceptions. Evil exists because of the logical impossibility of responding rationally to it. God desires to stop evil, but paradoxically his omnipotence makes this desire unsatisfiable. You might be worried that this just replaces one theological problem with another. If God doesn't act in accordance with value maximization, would he even act at all? Would he just sit around doing nothing because any action of an omnipotent being is fraught with analysis paralysis? Well, even if value maximization is screened off, it's just one specific desire. Presumably, God has other desires that can still motivate him to act. For example, since God is omnibenevolent, we would expect God to desire to act in accordance with moral perfection. Assuming utilitarianism is false, a desire to behave morally is distinct from a desire to maximize the amount of goodness that exists. So we can still talk about the sorts of things God would and would not do. For example, let's say God promised to do something. Can we expect him to keep this promise if he screened off value maximization? Maybe fulfilling his promise would increase the amount of goodness that exists, but that doesn't matter. However, God also has a desire to behave morally perfectly, and it's morally wrong to break promises. So this separate desire would motivate God to keep his promise. Now, this example shows that it's logically possible for God to act despite screening off value maximization. We could theoretically end the discussion there. God doesn't stop evil because he screened off value maximization, but we can still vaguely attribute some actions to God because of other unspecified desires. The end. And if your only goal is to avoid the problem of evil, that's technically enough. But stopping here makes for an incredibly unsatisfying theodicy. I am honestly quite horrified by the thought of someone asking, why doesn't God stop some of the evil in the world? And a theist answering, well, that right there is a slippery slope. What's next? God stopping more evil? God stopping evil and doing good? Where would it end? Now, that being said, just because a theodicy is unsatisfying, that doesn't automatically make it false. If the truth is unsatisfying, it's still true. But there's a deeper problem with stopping the discussion here. Taking a step back, we want a theory of reality that explains as much of the data as possible. This theodicy actually does a really good job when it comes to evil. It explains why the universe appears to behave so indifferently so often, despite the existence of a tri-omni God. But we theists are shooting ourselves in the foot if theism becomes totally unable to explain other data, like fine-tuning. Why create anything at all, let alone a universe full of life, if not value maximization? And what about Christian theology? Why did God become incarnate? Why will he resurrect the dead? And so on. So ideally, the No Best World Theodicy should be paired with a replacement for value maximization, a proposal for why God still acts the way he does. This is an area I really think could benefit from active development. There's a lot of directions to explore from here. If I had more time, I would talk about the concept of satisficing and moral obligations towards merely possible persons. But for the sake of brevity, I'll only discuss one possible replacement for standard value maximization. If we analyze God's options for any single action that he could perform at a particular moment, it might very well be the case that he has an infinite hierarchy of better and better options because of causal finitism or some other metaphysical limit. But what if we consider sets of actions? Does this analysis hold true if we considered actions God could take over time? Consider a world where God makes a good thing every day for all eternity. It doesn't seem this set of actions can be improved on. Throughout the entire timeline, infinite good stuff is made. Sure, God has other options, like a world where he makes 2 good things every day. But the same amount of good stuff is made. Infinity. By analogy, there are just as many even integers as there are integers. But both of these worlds are better than a world where God only makes a finite number of good things. So if we consider sets of actions, there is a best that can be achieved. Any world such that the amount of good stuff that exists approaches infinity as time goes on ties for first place in terms of goodness. Or, put another way, any world that has a potentially infinite amount of goodness is one of the best possible worlds. So here's the proposal. Value maximization actually has 2 prongs. On the one hand, it leads to a desire to do the best possible action at any individual moment in time. This is an unsatisfiable desire, so it gets screened off. But the second prong is a distinct desire to order one's actions over time to maximize value in the long run. This latter desire can be satisfied by ensuring that the amount of goodness that exists will increase over time. This desire is not screened off. This amendment to the standard No Best World Theodicy can help explain why God created the world and why he will resurrect the dead. We would expect God to create stuff because if nothing is created, then there is no way for the amount of good that exists to increase. And if good stuff dies and stops existing after a finite amount of time, then that also stops goodness from increasing. But just because God is ensuring that the amount of goodness tends towards infinity, that's consistent with there being lots of evil at a particular moment. This picture might be less satisfying than a standard greater goods theodicy, but it still has a hopeful aspect to it. However, I want to emphasize that there is still a lot of work to be done. I would love to see more exploration on other possible ways of amending the standard no best world theodicy, or how the no best world theodicy pairs with other more standard theodicies to maximize the explanatory power of theism. But that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Remember, Christ died for our sins and rose again.